Chicago.
And to talk about these recent cases involving teachers and students, once again, I'm joined by clinical psychologist Alan Lipman. All right, we're looking at these women.
Right.
They are gorgeous. Are we just not seeing the other teachers who are plain? Is it just that we're fascinated by why someone who looks like that, a living Barbie doll, would need to have sex with a young kid?
Well, now that's a very interesting thing to say, Contessa, a living Barbie doll, because it really puts a finger on the way that we view sexuality in this culture, that it's kind of all on the outside. And it's not really a criticism, because there's so many forces in our society that make us look at it this way. Look, underneath the Barbie doll skin of every man and every woman is, as we know, a kind of a complicated and often conflicting sexuality. All of us get different kinds of message about sex in our families, in our communities, in our media, that it's often difficult to assimilate and make sense of. And what happens with these women, whether they have a Barbie doll front or something less, we might say,
I'm curious.
Is that, Contessa, they don't develop sexually in the same way that many other women do. So inside, they're still very young sexually, even though on the outside they may look very poised and even beautiful.
I'm curious, too, when we're talking about teachers and students. A 1988 study found that men reacted less negatively to sexual abuse than women. Do you see that that's the case?
Well, I think there's a kind of cultural stereotype, you know, the kind of locker room braggadocio that, why is he complaining? That was said, for example, in the Lipman case. And, you know, there's something to that stereotype when viewed from a distance, but let's look closer. In the case of Villy, you know, he wound up being hospitalized for depression. He wound up struggling with alcoholism, and he wound up dropping out of school. This is abuse. And the women who suffer from this are suffering from a mental disorder. And it's our kind of stereotypic notions about sexuality, kind of viewed from a distance, that prevent us from seeing the individual impact on young kids who are not ready for this kind of intense sexual relationship.
And do you think that this is an issue with teacher-student relationships because one grown-up now is in a position of power? Or is it just with grown-ups versus teenagers?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, we should be careful to not exaggerate the frequency of this. A very large study that was done of female sex offenders demonstrated that teacher-student sexual offenses with a female teacher is the least frequent category of female sex offending. This most happens between, believe it or not, the even more shocking situation of mother and child. Now, the frequency of overall female sexual offending is very low. It's clearly blown out of proportion in the attention that we give it in the media because of the shocking incidence of it. It just doesn't happen that much between teachers and students, but it clearly is an issue of power, just like it is with male sexual offending, Contessa.
And do you think that when you're talking about the long-term impact of a relationship between a male teenager and a teacher or any older woman, do they seek out older women instead of people their own age? Do you think that any of the beginning sparks lie with the teenager?
They do, but only in a very kind of simplistic sense. So let's take the case of a 13-year-old boy who views the teacher as attractive and perhaps is trying to prove to his friends that he can win her, as seems to have been the case initially with Villy. Well, the teacher should be in the position of recognizing that this is a young man who is just testing his early notions of nascent sexuality, and should recognize that she's in a different place. She's the responsible adult with a fiduciary responsibility to not respond to those sexual advances. This is where we come full circle, Contessa, and recognize that it's the women's psychological vulnerability, their own adolescent sexual status inside their own minds, that makes them vulnerable to victimizing these boys in these situations.
Clinical psychologist Alan Lipman, thank you so much for sharing your insight today.
You're welcome, Contessa.
That will do it for our look at the issues surrounding sexual relationships between female teachers and their male students.